Imagine this. A huge, modern Boeing 777, nearly 240 people on board, just, well, it vanishes.
Yeah, not a crash landing, no distress signal, nothing. It just disappears off the radar.
Yeah.
In today's world, with all our connectivity.
That's the chilling reality of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. It's been over a decade, and it's still aviation's biggest mystery.
And what's really fascinating, or maybe disturbing, about MH370 is how the silence itself, the complete lack of information, became the most critical piece of data.
Right.
It forced investigators to chase down every tiny electronic whisper, every faint signal. So our mission today, in this deep dive, is really to sift through all that fragmented information.
Years of it.
Exactly. Rumors, reports, hard data.
Yeah.
Try to piece together the most evidence-based timeline of what probably happened, and maybe explore why it's still such a profound mystery.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. We need to go back to what seemed like a completely normal flight.
Mm-hmm.
MH370 takes off from Kuala Lumpur. It's 12:41 a.m. local time, March 8th, 2014. Heading to Beijing.
Everything looked routine. Pre-flight checks done. Cargo loaded, those mangosteens, 4.5 tons of them.
And the lithium-ion batteries, which became a whole thing later.
Right, those two. And then the last voice communication, that was at 1:19 a.m.
First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, right?
Yeah, just a casual, all right, good night, Malaysian 370 to Kuala Lumpur ATC. Not perfectly standard phrasing, maybe, but nothing to raise an alarm.
Just the last normal sound from the plane.
And then just 2 minutes later, at 1:21 a.m., that's the critical moment.
The transponder.
Exactly. The transponder, which basically tells air traffic control who the plane is and how high it is, it just shuts off. Poof. Gone from their screens.
So it vanished from civilian radar in Malaysia and Vietnam.
Instantly. But, and this is crucial, the Malaysian Air Force primary radar, which works differently, it just detects objects, doesn't need a signal, but it kept tracking an unidentified blip.
An unidentified blip, which was MH370.
Correct. And the shocking thing was, it hadn't crashed. It made a sharp, deliberate turn westward, back across Malaysia.
Deliberate, not just drifting.
No, definitely not. It flew precisely along known navigation waypoints, even flew right along the border between Malaysia and Thailand. It really looks like someone was trying very hard not to be seen by either country's radar.
Wow, okay.
And it kept flying west out over the Andaman Sea until it finally went out of Malaysian military radar range at 2:22 a.m.
And this initial period, the response,
Yeah.
it wasn't great, was it?
No, that's putting it mildly. The official ICAO investigation later pointed out, no, that's where the satellite data comes in. Just 3 minutes after leaving military radar range at 2:25 a.m., something else happened. The plane's satellite data unit, the SDU, it sent a logon request to an Inmarsat satellite.
A logon request, like it was rebooting.
Sort of, yeah. And this is hugely significant. An SDU doesn't just reboot itself because of a glitch, and there's no simple on-off switch for it in the cockpit.
So how?
You'd need technical knowledge. You'd have to manipulate the power supply, maybe through the complex electrical system, or by physically accessing a circuit breaker, probably in the electronics bay, the EE bay, under the cabin floor.
Which strongly suggests someone deliberately turned it off and then back on again.
That's the most logical conclusion, yes, a deliberate act. Now, after that reboot, there was no actual data sent, like messages or flight information, but the SDU kept sending these automated hourly pings, basically, handshakes to the satellite.
Just confirming it was still there.
Pretty much.
Sure.
And the engineers at Inmarsat, they did some amazing work extracting information from these incredibly faint signals. 2 key things. First, the burst timing offset, or BTO. That measures the time it took the signal to travel. From that, they could calculate the plane's distance from the satellite at each ping, which gives you these big arcs on a map where the plane must have been.
Like drawing circles from the satellite's position.
Exactly. But that doesn't tell you where on the arc the plane was. That's where the second piece comes in. The burst frequency offset, BFO.
Right, the Doppler effect thing.
Precisely. Tiny shifts in the signal's frequency caused by the plane's movement relative to the satellite. Analyzing that BFO data was incredibly complex, but it was the key. It showed definitively that after turning back, MH370 flew south, deep into the remote southern Indian Ocean, not north.
Wow. So that ruled out a lot of other theories right there.
Absolutely. The data showed it kept flying for about 6 more hours after that SDU reboot. The last complete handshake, the 7th one, was at 8:11 a.m. Then there was a partial ping at 8:19 a.m.
Which is believed to be the end.
That's the assumption. Probably fuel exhaustion, system shutting down, leading to the crash. Those final signals defined what's called the seventh arc, the main search area.
It raises the chilling question, doesn't it? Why would anyone go to such incredible lengths to make a plane disappear like this? So completely, so systematically.
That's the core of the mystery.
Yeah, this is where it gets really, really interesting and, frankly, disturbing. You've got the communications being shut down step by step, the precise turns, clearly avoiding radar, that SDU reboot needing technical know-how. It just screams premeditation, doesn't it?
It points very strongly towards someone highly skilled, someone who knew that aircraft inside out, deliberately taking these actions.
Not some sudden emergency. No fire, no depressurization causing chaos.
The evidence doesn't align with those scenarios. No distress calls, just controlled silence.
And you mentioned the damage to trust earlier, especially with the families in China. That initial lack of clear communication, the confusion, it just created this enormous information vacuum.
It really did, and it laid the groundwork for years of anguish and suspicion.
So with all these signs pointing towards a deliberate act, you inevitably have to look at who was in the cockpit.
Yes. The focus naturally fell on the two pilots, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid.
Tell us about Captain Zahari first.
Okay, Captain Zahari, 53 years old, vastly experienced. Over 18,000 flight hours. A senior captain. The official investigation reports concluded he was mentally sound, no obvious stress, fit to fly.
But there were other reports, weren't there? More personal stuff.
There were media reports, comments from friends, painted a more complex picture. Talk of possible marital problems, maybe a midlife crisis, rumors of affairs. He apparently sent obsessive messages to some models online.
And the political angle.
Yes, he was known to be a vocal critic of the Malaysian government. And there was a connection, albeit loose, to an opposition leader who'd actually been jailed the day before the flight vanished. So that fueled political motive theories, though there's no hard proof.
But the flight simulator, that seems like the most concrete, maybe the most chilling piece of evidence related to him.
It is certainly the most compelling piece of circumstantial evidence. The FBI managed to recover data that had been deleted from his home flight simulator.
Deleted data. That's suspicious in itself.
Very. And this data, from about a month before the flight, showed a simulated route. It started in Kuala Lumpur, flew out over the Malacca Strait, turned south into the remote southern Indian Ocean, and continued until the simulated plane ran out of fuel.
Wow, that's eerily similar to the actual flight path derived from the satellite data.
Strikingly similar, not identical, but the destination, that remote patch of ocean.
Yeah.
It's hard to dismiss as coincidence. Many investigators see it as evidence of planning, maybe a rehearsal. It's the closest thing, as you said, to some kind of acknowledgement of intent.
And the fact it was deleted.
Suggests whoever flew that simulation knew it might look incriminating.
Okay, what about the first officer, Fariq Abdul Hamid?
Fariq was much younger, 27. Less experienced, especially on the Boeing 777. MH370 was actually his final check flight, his last training flight before being fully certified on that aircraft type.
So, a big flight for him.
Definitely. Generally described as a nice young man, a good boy planning to get married, though there was that past incident.
Right. Inviting passengers into the cockpit.
Yeah, on a previous flight, he and another pilot had invited two young women into the cockpit for the whole flight, which is obviously unprofessional and against regulations.
Did anything tie him directly to the plane's unusual path?
Interestingly, yes, in a way that corroborated the military radar data. His mobile phone briefly connected to a cell tower on Penang Island as the plane flew west, back over Malaysia.
So that placed the plane exactly where the military radar showed it turning back.
Correct. It helped confirm that westward turn wasn't just a radar anomaly.
Okay, so we have strong indicators of pilot action, but for over a year there was nothing physical. Then things started washing ashore.
Yes, after more than a year of searching the empty ocean, July 2015, a piece of aircraft wing, a flaperone, washed up on Reunion Island, way over in the western Indian Ocean.
And this was confirmed.
Absolutely confirmed. Serial numbers matched. It was from a Boeing 777. And since MH370 was the only 7777 missing in the entire Indian Ocean.
That was it, the first concrete proof it crashed there.
It was a massive breakthrough. It proved the plane ended up in the southern Indian Ocean, validating all that complex Inmarsat data analysis.
But the flaperone itself, the way it was damaged, caused some debate, didn't it?
It did. Big debate. Some experts, like the Canadian investigator Larry Vance, looked closely at the damage. The trailing edge was heavily damaged, suggesting the flaps were extended when it hit the water, but the leading edge had relatively little damage,
Meaning?
meaning it likely hit the water at a relatively low speed in a controlled ditching attempt. Someone is flying the plane right to the end, trying to land it on the water, not just letting it fall out of the sky.
And that contradicts the main theory the search was based on.
Exactly. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau, the ATSB, their main scenario was the death dive, or ghost flight pilots incapacitated, plane flying on autopilot until fuel runs out, then an uncontrolled high-speed crash. The flaperon evidence suggests that might be wrong. It points back to active control.
Have other pieces turned up?
Yes, quite a few. Over 40 pieces now found along coastlines in Africa, Mozambique, South Africa, Madagascar, Mauritius. Mostly small fragments, but at least 3, including the flaperon, have been officially confirmed by serial number. Things like parts of the engine covering, interior cabin pieces.
And was it something about barnacles?
Ah, yes, the barnacles. Lepus antitifera, goose barnacles, found growing on the flaperon. A really novel approach. Scientists realized the chemical makeup of their shells changes depending on the temperature of the water they grew in.
So you could potentially trace where the debris drifted from.
That's the hope. By analyzing the layers of the shells, they might be able to reconstruct the drift paths across the ocean, potentially narrowing down the crash location. It's complex, but fascinating science.
It really is. Okay, let's circle back to the cargo. We mentioned the mangosteens and batteries. That battery fire theory was huge early on, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. The cargo list showed, yes, 4.5 tons of mangosteens, but also over 2,400 kilos of other cargo from a company called NNR Global Logistics. That included 221 kilos of lithium-ion batteries.
And the authorities didn't reveal the batteries were on board straight away.
No, that information came out later, which fueled suspicion. Lithium-ion batteries can be flammable. There had been warnings. So the theory took hold. Maybe a battery fire started, knocked out communications, incapacitated the crew.
But the official investigation didn't agree.
No, the final Malaysian report pretty much dismissed it. They concluded the batteries were packaged correctly, according to regulations, and they were separated from the mangosteens. They even did experiments, mixing mangosteen juice with batteries, couldn't get a fire going.
What about the rest of that NNR cargo?
That remained a bit murky for a while. It was eventually clarified as mostly radio accessories and chargers, but the initial lack of detail just added to the mistrust.
So, looking at that whole section, the evidence, the pilots, the debris, the cargo, it seems like the official stories sometimes struggle to keep up with where the evidence was pointing.
I think that's fair to say. You see this pattern, perhaps, where the simpler explanation, like a ghost flight caused by an accident, might have seemed preferable to authorities than the deeply troubling possibility of a deliberate act by a pilot. It potentially lessens the airline's or even the country's perceived responsibility.
Okay, let's try and pull these threads together. We've got conflicting ideas, missing pieces. But if you apply something like Occam's razor, looking for the simplest explanation that fits all the facts, where does that lead?
It leads quite strongly towards deliberate pilot action. That theory, particularly focusing on the captain due to the simulator evidence, seems to be the most robust. It's the one that aligns best with all the key pieces of evidence we've discussed.
Let's recap why.
Okay, 1. The communication systems being shut down sequentially transponder first, then ACARS. That shows intent, not just failure. 2. The precise turnback, flying along waypoints, evading radar requires skill, not disorientation. 3. The SDU reboot needs specific knowledge or physical access, not a random event. 4. The simulator data suggests planning or rehearsal. 5. The flaperon damage points to a controlled ditching, not an uncontrolled crash.
And maybe a motive, however unproven, in the captain's reported personal issues or political views.
Possibly, yes. That provides context, even if it's not definitive proof of motive. But just looking at the what and the how, deliberate action by someone in control, is the simplest explanation fitting those facts.
It is deeply uncomfortable, though. What's the biggest hole in that theory?
The biggest hole is still the why, the lack of a clear, proven motive. Official reports found no definitive psychological red flags that would guarantee such an action. That's the painful, unanswered part. But even without the why, the how points overwhelmingly in that direction.
How did the other theories stack up against this evidence? Hypoxia?
The ghost flight, or hypoxia theory, which the ATSB initially favored. It just doesn't work with the evidence. Rapid depressurization might incapacitate people, yes, but it doesn't explain the deliberate turn, the precise navigation for hours, or that complex SDU reboot. A hypoxic pilot would likely be confused, Maybe make erratic inputs, not fly a complex, evasive route for 7 hours.
And the fire theory? From the batteries or elsewhere?
Also doesn't fit. A fire bad enough to knock out multiple redundant communication systems and incapacitate the crew would almost certainly have caused catastrophic damage much faster. The plane wouldn't likely fly on for another 7 hours, plus there's no fire damage seen on any of the recovered debris. And again, the controlled flight path doesn't match battling a major fire.
What about hijacking by someone else, a third party?
Highly unlikely. Post 9/11 cockpits are heavily reinforced, very hard to break into without pilot help. No credible group ever claimed responsibility, which is unusual for terrorism. And what would be the goal of flying the plane to the most remote part of the Indian Ocean? It doesn't make strategic sense. Plus, the debris confirms it crashed there, wasn't secretly landed somewhere.
So when you weigh it all up,
Deliberate pilot action remains the theory that best explains the known facts, the sequence of events, the technical evidence. It fits the what and the how far better than anything else proposed.
okay. That conclusion then leads us to the search itself. An absolutely monumental effort.
Monumental is the word. It became the largest, most expensive, most technologically challenging search in aviation history.
Once they knew it was the southern Indian Ocean, what did that underwater search involve?
It was primarily led by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, the ATSB, from 2014 to early 2017. They focused on that Seventh Arc area, mapping and searching about 120,000 square kilometers of seabed.
Which sounds huge, and the conditions there are.
Brutal. Absolutely brutal. You're talking about the roaring 40s, some of the worst weather on the planet. It's incredibly remote, thousands of kilometers from land. And the seabed itself is savage, deep trenches, underwater volcanoes, sheer cliffs, a nightmare environment for a search.
What technology were they using down there?
They started with things like towed pinger locators, trying to listen for the signals from the black boxes, but the batteries on those likely died after 30 days. The main effort involved sonar mapping, using towed sonar devices and autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, like the Bluefin 21, to scan the seabed in detail.
And after all that effort?
Nothing. The main wreckage wasn't found. The official search was suspended in early 2017. Then a private company, Ocean Infinity, came in 2018.
On a no-find, no-fee basis.
Yes, they searched a huge area, also using advanced AUVs, but they didn't find it either.
So traditional methods failed. But that wasn't the end of the story. Innovation kicked in, didn't it? Something that sounds almost like science fiction.
It really does. When the conventional tools didn't work, it forced people to think outside the box. And this led to the idea of using WSPR Data Week Signal Propagation Reporter.
Explain that. What is WSPR?
Okay, WSPR is basically a global network run by amateur radio enthusiasts. They transmit and receive very low-power radio signals all over the world to test propagation paths. An engineer named Richard Godfrey had this pioneering idea. What if a large aircraft, like a 777, flying through these signals disrupts them, leaves a kind of electronic scar or blip in the massive WSPR database?
Like a disturbance in the force.
Something like that. Godfrey claimed he went back through the archived WSPR data for March 8, 2014, and found anomalous disturbances that lined up with MH370's predicted flight path after it disappeared from all conventional radar.
And this pointed to a new potential crash site.
Yes, a new, more specific, and slightly different search area based on these WSPR tracks. Now, it's important to say this technique is still relatively new for this purpose. It's being studied and validated by places like the University of Liverpool. It's promising, but not definitively proven yet.
But promising enough for another search.
Promising enough, combined with refined analysis of where the confirmed debris likely drifted from, that the Malaysian government has given the green light for Ocean Infinity to go back.
When is this happening?
They're aiming for 2025. And again, it's on a no-find, no-fee basis. Ocean Infinity stands to get paid up to $70 million only if they find the main wreckage. And find means locating key parts, potentially recovering them.
Are they using the same tech as before?
They're coming back with their new Armada fleet. These are uncrewed robotic surface vessels controlling even more advanced AUVs for the deep-sea search. It's a big technological step up even from their 2018 search.
It's quite fascinating, isn't it, how this terrible mystery has accidentally spurred so much innovation in deep-sea exploration and data analysis.
It really has. It's become a catalyst, pushing the boundaries to make sure, hopefully, that a plane can never just vanish like this again.
Okay, but when a mystery this huge remains unsolved for so long, it does create space for other explanations to take root, doesn't it? the conspiracy theories.
Absolutely inevitable. We talked about that information vacuum created right at the start by the delays, the contradictions, the lack of transparency from the Malaysian authorities especially.
Nature abhors a vacuum.
And human nature really dislikes an unexplained tragedy. That void was just instantly filled with speculation, rumor, and then increasingly elaborate conspiracy theories. Social media amplified everything, creating these alternative narratives that became very hard to counter with facts.
It raises that question. How does a genuine tragedy become this breeding ground for mistrust and, well, alternative facts?
MH370 is a prime case study. Let's look at a couple of the big theories. The Diego Garcia one was very popular early on.
The idea it landed at the U.S. military base there?
Yes. Maybe hijacked by the U.S., maybe the pilot defected, but it's directly contradicted by the hard evidence. Firstly, the Inmarsat data, particularly the BFO analysis, showed the plane flew south. Diego Garcia is northwest, completely the wrong direction.
And the debris.
Exactly. Debris confirmed to be from MH370 washed up on African beaches. Ocean currents make it physically impossible for that debris to have come from a crash anywhere near Diego Garcia. It had to come from the southern Indian Ocean.
Okay, what about the Russian hijacking theory? That one got a lot of press.
Yeah, the idea, pushed by journalist Jeff Wise, among others, was that maybe sophisticated hijackers, possibly Russian, took control electronically, maybe from that eBay we mentioned, and crucially, they spoofed the Inmarsat data to make it look like the plane flew south, while it actually flew north, maybe to Kazakhstan.
That sounds complex.
Incredibly complex. You're talking state-level technical capability to perfectly fake those satellite signals for hours. But more importantly, it's completely debunked by the physical evidence.
The debris again.
The debris again. If the plane flew north to Kazakhstan, how did parts of it end up floating in the southern Indian Ocean and washing ashore in Africa? It just doesn't work.
Any others worth mentioning? Shot down theory.
That one pops up too, accidentally shot down by some military. But again, the evidence contradicts it. The plane flew on for 7 hours after disappearing from radar. A shootdown would mean immediate destruction, or at least loss of control, debris near the location, probably distress calls. None of that happened.
And then you get the really fringe stuff.
Oh yeah, theories involving specific patents held by passengers, UFOs, wormholes, you name it, none backed by any credible evidence.
It's just a wild ecosystem of misinformation that grew out of that initial lack of trust, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
For some people, even the physical debris wasn't convincing. They'd just say it was planted.
Precisely. It shows how powerful that initial information vacuum was and how hard it is to restore trust once it's broken. Facts struggle against deeply held beliefs, especially when fueled online.
So, moving beyond the mystery itself, MH370 has had a lasting impact, hasn't it? On aviation, on international relations.
A profound impact, especially on aviation safety. The fact that a modern jet could just disappear triggered a fundamental rethink.
What were the key changes?
The big one is GAAS, the Global Aeronautical Distress and Safety System. Driven by ICO, the UN's aviation body, it's a whole suite of new standards designed specifically to prevent another MH370. It's basically the world saying, this can never happen again.
How does it work?
Several layers. Normal tracking is tighter. Airlines now generally track flights every 15 minutes, sometimes even more frequently. But the absolute key change is autonomous distress tracking, ADT. Meaning if a plane gets into trouble, deviates significantly from its flight plan, loses power, things like that, it must now automatically start transmitting its position every single minute through an emergency locator system that cannot be easily disabled from the cockpit.
You can't just switch everything off anymore.
That's the intention. It guarantees a distress signal and location data if things go seriously wrong. There are also improvements for finding wreckage after a crash. Black box pingers now have to last 90 days, up from 30. And there's development of deployable recorders, black boxes designed to eject from the plane before impact and float.
What about the cockpit voice recorder? Still only 2 hours.
There's a big push to extend that to 25 hours to capture the entire flight, not just the final moments. That hasn't been universally mandated everywhere yet, but the pressure is on. And while the Germanwings 9525 crash, the pilot suicide in the Alps was maybe a more direct trigger, MH370 definitely contributed to a global tightening of pilot mental health screening and psychological assessments.
So it really was a black swan event that forced systemic change.
Absolutely. It exposed vulnerabilities nobody thought existed and forced a complete overhaul of global tracking standards.
And beyond aviation, what about the political fallout?
Significant, especially between Malaysia and China. Remember, 153 passengers were Chinese nationals. Beijing was extremely critical of Malaysia's handling of the crisis, the communication, the search efforts. It caused real diplomatic tension, public protests in China, boycotts of Malaysian tourism.
It strained that relationship badly.
Severely, and more broadly, it highlighted weaknesses in regional cooperation. The initial reluctance of some neighboring countries to share potentially sensitive military radar data quickly definitely hampered the search in those crucial early days.
But perhaps the most powerful legacy, the one that continues today, is the human one, the families.
Absolutely. Above all else, MH370 is a story of enduring pain, unanswered questions, but also incredible resilience from the families of those on board.
Voice 370.
Voice 370, the main group representing the next of kin. Their strength and persistence have been extraordinary. They refuse to let the world forget. They constantly pushed for answers, demanded transparency, like getting that full cargo manifest released. They lobbied relentlessly for the search to continue.
And the new search in 2025. That's largely down to them.
It really is. Their sustained pressure, their advocacy, refusing to give up hope, was instrumental in convincing the Malaysian government to approve this new attempt by Ocean Infinity, especially after the official search ended years ago.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Even in our hyper-connected, technologically advanced world, something like this can happen. A huge plane can vanish, and despite everything, the mystery endures.
It's a profound challenge to our sense of certainty, our need for closure. MH370 serves as this deeply unsettling reminder of the limits of our current technology, the vastness of the unknown parts of our planet, and just the enduring power of hope against seemingly impossible odds.
So we've unpacked the decades worth of data, theories, searching. We have, it seems, a pretty strong understanding now of the what and the how. A deliberate act led the plane to its end in the remote southern Indian Ocean. But that, why? That remains the agonizing unanswered question right at the heart of it all.
And the only real hope of answering that why lies beneath the waves. Finding the main wreckage, crucially recovering the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, that's likely the only way to get definitive answers, to finally give those families the closure they deserve, and to close the book on one of aviation's most painful and enduring mysteries. What strikes you most when you think about this whole decade-long saga of loss, the search, and that unending quest for truth?